After Stalin died in 1953, there was a power struggle, with the main contenders being Malenkov, chairman of the Council of Ministers and head of the government, Beria, Minister of Internal Affairs with control over the secret police, and Khrushchev, who was the secretary of the party Central Committee. Khrushchev wanted collective leadership and did not want power to rest in the hands of just one individual, as it had under Stalin. He did become the most powerful man in the party, certainly after the demise of Malenkov in 1955, but he seems to have believed truly that the Stalinist method of power in the hands of just one man was wrong. In this way, Khrushchev seems to have differed from all the other rulers that came before, with perhaps the exception of the provisional government. Not all of his methods were always different to the other rulers though, in particular when he and others decided to act against Beria. Many of the top people in the party distrusted Beria, who was associated with the purges of the Stalinist period. Beria held huge power as Minister of Internal Affairs, which particularly worried those at the top of the party because in the past he'd been utterly ruthless with his handling of the secret police. Khrushchev had Beria arrested, denounced as a traitor, which was rubbish and clearly falsified, and Beria was shot. It must be said that under Khrushchev, this was the only occasion in which a well-known party member was shot after falling out with the leadership. For example, when Malenkov, Molotov and Kaganovich attempted to oust Khrushchev from power in 1957, something that would have been totally unheard of in Stalin's period, this so-called anti-party group was not shot. Instead, they were given humiliating positions elsewhere in the Soviet Union. Malenkov was made a manager of a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan, Kaganovich was made manager of a potassium plant in the Urals, and Molotov was made ambassador to Mongolia. This was a purge, but nothing like those of the Stalinist period. Khrushchev lifted some censorship. Some books were allowed that criticised the Soviet Union, particularly the Soviet Union under Stalin, for obvious reasons. However, it was never quite clear where the line was drawn. Make no mistake, many people ended up in the Gulag for speaking out against the regime under Khrushchev, but because of the relaxation of the terror of Stalin's reign, many more people were willing to take the risk, and many got away with it. Khrushchev gave Soviet satellite states greater freedom, for example placing a more liberal communist Imre Nagy, or Nagy, if you were looking at the English spelling, it's probably easy for you to remember it that way. Anyway, he put him into power in Hungary. However, Nagy, we're going to call him, announced he was leaving the Warsaw Pact. And so what Khrushchev did was, he sent tanks in to reassert control, and this ended up with the deaths of thousands of Hungarians. Khrushchev said that the inevitable war with the capitalist West that Stalin preached about all the time was not inevitable at all. He said that a war with the capitalist West would only lead to something called mutually assured destruction, which is a brilliant acronym, MAD. And Khrushchev went on foreign visits, even to America. Now, if you're comparing him to Stalin and Lenin, Stalin obviously is preaching about this inevitable war with the capitalist West, and Lenin, certainly to begin with, thinks that Russia was the start of a communist revolution that would spread across the globe. The Communist Party was still the only legal party in the USSR, and Khrushchev was undoubtedly a committed communist. Malenkov had wanted to introduce some capitalist elements into the economy, and this was one reason why he was ousted from any power. It's perhaps significant that Khrushchev released tens of thousands of people from the gulags, but he didn't shut them down. He kept collectivization in agriculture, but he gave more incentives to peasants by reducing tax, taking steps to keep agriculture prices high, and allowing them larger private plots of land to grow their own produce. He also allowed them to sell some of their own private produce on a private market. This all had some similarities with the NEP of Lenin's time, or the New Economic Policy. His most famous agricultural policy was the Virgin Land Campaign, in which he encouraged the farming of land that had not previously been cultivated. This was a success to begin with, and the USSR agricultural yield increased. But poor farming methods exhausted the soil, and poor weather led to smaller yields later in his reign. This undermined Khrushchev and was one reason for his loss of power, because he put so much weight and faith in this Virgin Land campaign. Khrushchev moved away from a focus on heavy industry and encouraged the production of more consumer goods, but the quality of them was poor as factories tried to meet the huge production targets of the economic plans. He introduced a 7-year plan for industry, but with more realistic targets than Stalin set in his 5-year plans. Still unrealistic, but a little bit less unrealistic. Still, there was pressure on local managers to meet targets, and it's very likely that figures were massaged to give a rosier picture of the economy than was likely the reality. During Khrushchev's period of power, the West genuinely feared that the USSR was getting ahead, particularly because they were winning the space race by putting the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. This is a section we're going to call the Facts About Khrushchev section, largely because these are just facts about Khrushchev. In at 1 is in 1950 there were 121,000 kolkhozs, which is the word for one type of collective farm, and in 1960 there were just 44,000. This is not because Khrushchev was getting rid of collective farms, it's because he'd made them even bigger and joined them together. Fact number 2 is that 500,000 people were encouraged and cajoled west to cultivate the virgin lands under Khrushchev. Fact number 3, like Stalin, Khrushchev believed in the central control of agriculture and of course in the collectivization of farms. Point number 4, Khrushchev was the only one of any of the Russian rulers who we look at in this module who had done manual labour in his life. He worked as a pipe fitter in Donetsk in Ukraine. The next fact is that Nicholas II was the only other ruler not to die as ruler of Russia in the period we're studying, and unlike Nicholas, Khrushchev was able to retire and die in peace. And the last fact is 3,000 people were killed in Hungary in 1956 when Khrushchev sent in the Soviet army, after the Hungarians rose up against their against the USSR essentially, and the people doing the USSR's bidding. So those are the facts about Khrushchev. And so to a conclusion. Which ruler was Khrushchev least similar to? Which ruler was Khrushchev most similar to? Well, what's about to come are only my opinions. Other teachers would disagree, other historians would disagree. You can agree or disagree, and in fact, if you've read, learned and worked hard enough, I'd be surprised if you did agree with everything that I said. Anyway, my conclusion is that it's easier to begin with who Khrushchev was least similar to, and that would be the obvious choice of Stalin, perhaps. Given his de-Stalinisation programme and the secret speech of 1956. Well, let's explore that. Stalin's purges led to the deaths of an estimated 800,000 people, but all of the other rulers also used execution to deal with dissenters. Alexander III, for example, had Lenin's brother executed for his part in a plot against him. Nicholas II ruled over a country in which over 100 people were shot dead and many more wounded for the demonstrations on Bloody Sunday in 1905. Lenin used the Cheka to sniff out counter-revolutions, many of whom ended up dead. Khrushchev was different in that he favoured the gulag or humiliating demotions and avoided using the executioner. Of course, Beria is the most well-known exception. Another way in which Khrushchev could be seen as fairly unique was that he did not have his own cult of personality. Lenin famously denounced the Tsars for their cults of personality, and Stalin's growth of a cult of personality was a blatant violation of Marxist-Leninism principles. Lenin did not have a cult of personality during his life, but he did have one attached to him nonetheless after his death. For example, his body was embalmed and put in a mausoleum. You can still see it to this day, and people used to queue up for hours to be able to see Lenin's body. Khrushchev avoided a cult of personality, denounced it in his secret speech, and took part in a period of collective leadership, at least until the fall from grace of Malenkov, Molotov and Kaganovich. Economically, Khrushchev differed from the Bolshevik leaders that came before him, in particular Stalin, because Khrushchev is most well known for being an enthusiastic agriculturalist, whereas Lenin and Stalin were far more preoccupied with the output of heavy industry. He did still maintain the economic plans of Stalin's period of rule, with a centralised economy and pressure exerted on local managers to meet the targets set in the plans. In his preoccupation with agriculture, perhaps Khrushchev can be seen as having been similar to Alexander II, whose famous emancipation edict changed the agricultural landscape of Russia. Ultimately, Alexander's emancipation of the serfs was flawed, because it was a compromise that satisfied nobody, and released a wave of opposition which grew in the Zemstva. Similarly, Khrushchev's Virgin Land campaign, on which he pinned so much, was ultimately deemed a failure when the agricultural output fell dramatically short of targets. Alexander's emancipation led to a growth in opposition, which may have led to his assassination by the People's Will in 1881. Khrushchev's failure with the Virgin Land campaign led to a growth in opposition from within the Communist Party, and ultimately his expulsion as leader. Perhaps ultimately Khrushchev can be deemed as having most in common with Lenin. Indeed, Khrushchev himself claimed to be continuing the work of Lenin, which he said had been distorted under Stalin for the personal gain of a totalitarian megalomaniac. Lenin wrote about his desire to create a utopian society in which the evils of the society then were eroded, and that there'd be no such thing as poverty. But after a fragile revolution, and with the onset of a brutal civil war, Lenin did not have peace and stability for a prolonged period, for us to be able to know how he would try to achieve this, because of course he died not long after the end of the Civil War. Of course, Stalin and Khrushchev both quoted Lenin and referred to his teachings, but Stalin more obviously contradicted Lenin's principles than Khrushchev did. Khrushchev did not ruthlessly try to further his own position of power. He made what appeared to have been genuine attempts to improve the lives of the proletariat with his housing programs and the increased focus on light industry. Ultimately, his misguided promotion of the planting of maize, which was totally unsuited to the Russian soil in the Virgin Lands, and the poor yield of the Virgin Lands, led to his downfall, but his interest in agriculture was another attempt by Khrushchev to improve the lot of the poor. So, in summary, I believe Khrushchev to have been most similar to Lenin. He followed the same ideology. Both appeared to share a desire to improve the lives of ordinary Russians, whereas Stalin would do anything to secure his position and seemed to have little genuine concern for the general population. I believe that Khrushchev had the least in common with the reactionary reign of Alexander III, whose increased censorship, use of the Okhrana and the promotion of capitalist interests was very different to the Khrushchev period. As with anything, there's similarities and differences between all of the rulers. Now don't forget, you can use this podcast to help you to learn facts and bits and pieces that I've told you, but if you want to be an A-grade A-level history student, ideally you'll be listening to the things that I'm saying and questioning them and thinking about them and deciding whether or not you agree based on your own research and learning.